Well, good evening and good morning and good afternoon to people of different regions and continents. Tonight, we're coming here for a IMG event. We have 5 speakers tonight to talk about a very important topic concerning the region in Asia. The topic is, will there be war in the Taiwan Strait? The war in Ukraine has been going on for nearly 1 year. And this is the context that we're gonna launch our this afternoon's or this morning's discussion. But before we go there, a brief introduction about IMG.
Thank you, Hairong. My name is Adhika Desai, and I'm the convener of the International Manifesto Group. And I'd just like to take a minute to tell you a little bit about the Manifesto Group. We are an international discussion group with members from different parts of the world. We basically try to create events like this to discuss important international trends and developments. We also have in 2021 launched a manifesto, which is entitled Through Pluripolarity to Socialism. You can find the manifesto and other details about the group at www.internationalmanifesto.org. I will share it later on in the chat as well. So please consider reading the manifesto, signing it, volunteering, donating. We're a very broad-based group. We are basically socialist and anti-imperialist. And if you share our views, we very much invite you to join us and collaborate with us. Thanks. Hairong.
Okay, thank you, Radhika. So the context for tonight's discussion is that the war in Ukraine has been taking a very heavy toll on both sides, in both countries, in Ukraine and Russia. And the current situation is that rather than working for peace negotiations, the US and NATO is supporting continued conflict. And at the same time, the Western mainstream media are constantly drumming up China threat and anti-Chinese sentiments. And that's increasing the tensions for war in East Asia. And while Western media and many politicians, they draw similarities between Taiwan, mainland China relations and Ukraine-Russia relations, these situations are historically different and politically different. So this is the context for us to come together for tonight's discussion. And the event has been organized with concerned scholars, both in mainland China, in Taiwan, and with IMG comrades. So in today's discussion, we have 5 speakers, and they are Sarah Flunder, Li Zhenbang, and Alan Borsett, Dick Lowe, and Ben Norton. And they're based in Taiwan, Hong Kong, Europe, Latin America. So we're gonna have dialogue about the very important question that's concerning all of us. And I will introduce each speaker as their turns to speak comes up. So tonight's the first speaker we have. Oh, by the way, myself, I'm Yan Hairong. I'm based in Tsinghua University. It's the Tsinghua Institute for Advanced Study in Humanities and Social Sciences. And my research includes China-Africa links, racialization of labor, China's agrarian change, and collective and cooperative rural economy. And the first speaker for tonight is Sarah Flanders. And she's a longstanding political activist and author based in New York City. And she's a leader of the United National Anti-War Coalition and the International Action Center. And she is the author of numerous books, including Capitalism on a Ventilator, The Impact of COVID-19 in China, the US. This is co-authored with Li Shuhin. And NATO and the Balkans, The Voices of Opposition, that's co-authored with Ramsey Clark. And I think, Sarah, you have a new book coming up, is that right?
That's right. Yes, it's released last month. Sanctions, a wrecking ball in a global economy.
Okay, great. So Sarah, the floor now is yours.
Thank you so much. And thank you also to International Manifesto Group for the opportunity of this discussion of will there be war in the Taiwan Straits? While escalating the US-NATO war against Russia in Ukraine, the United States is preparing at breakneck speed for war with China. Taiwan is the excuse. Taiwan is the pawn. US strategy is to expand NATO to China's periphery, create an Asian version of NATO to block, disrupt economic cooperation in Asia. This is a terrible danger to the people of Taiwan and all the people of China. Peoples throughout the entire region face a crisis that can destroy their lives and future and ruin their economies. The US-NATO war in Ukraine devastated the economy of Ukraine, but also disrupted the European Union, who went along with the sanctions demanded by the United States. Poor and working people in the US will be forced to pay for this war, as they pay for every war with steadily deteriorating conditions. The ominous mobilization taking place on the military and political level and the manufactured crisis over a Chinese hot air balloon is a new level in psychological war, propaganda war, to prepare the US population that China is an enemy, a danger, a threat. Why build such animosity against China? Why use scaremongering tactics that incite fear and hostility? Political voices, both Democrats and Republicans, try to outdo each other, condemning the balloon's passage as an invasion, a spy mission, a violation of US sovereignty. Any action by China is described now as threatening, provocative, expansionist. The same words are used again and again in news articles, politician statements. More ominously, in the same week, the four-star Air Force General, Michael Minahan, who's the head of Air Mobility Command, issued a leaked memo where he predicted war with China over Taiwan in 2 years. General Minahan oversees 107,000 airmen and 1,100 cargo and tanker and transport planes. This leaked memo is preparations for war in 2025, includes training, drills, and specific orders. Defeat China, prepare to fight and win, be prepared for deployment at a moment's notice. The Air Force, the Army, the Marines are on board. General Minahan praised the January 5th largest ever launch from a US base of huge C-17 transport aircrafts as training for a naval blockade of China. This is the opening round of massive missile and air assault on mainland China. It's the Pentagon's air-sea battle strategy. Now, China condemned this as reckless, provocative, and meant to put pressure. The Pentagon spokesperson said it's needed to preserve a peaceful, free, and open Indo-Pacific. Military preparations against China include US pressure for Japan to double its military budget, to become the third largest military in the world, in violation of the Japanese Constitution. The new agreement, announced February 2nd, grants US military access to 9 bases in the Philippines to counter China. Foreign bases are a direct violation of the Philippine Constitution. In 1992, a massive people's movement forced the US to close its bases in the Philippines. Now there's 9 new bases. There's been lots of balloon coverage, but no coverage of US threats to China. What's not covered? In any of the US corporate media, the daily US measures to openly threaten China. While one air balloon is considered an invasion, the impact of US aircraft carriers, battle groups with destroyers, fighter jets, nuclear submarines in China's territorial waters is not covered. The US Pacific Fleet consists of 200 ships, submarines, 1,200 aircraft, more than 130,000 sailors and civilians. No coverage. The US regularly sends naval patrols and destroyers through the 180-kilometer wide Taiwan Straits. This is a provocation and an arrogant display of US military power. So how do we view this? Most important is to assert again and again, China is one. China has not threatened Taiwan. China has only asserted what is recognized by the US and 180 other countries, and by the United Nations, and by all international bodies, that Taiwan is part of China. Now, there are daily announcements and coverage in the US media here that China is planning to invade Taiwan. There's no such plan. In the drive to find an excuse for war, the US government is reversing a position signed and agreed to more than 50 years ago. Washington is openly violating 3 different signed agreements, joint communiques it made with China in 1972, 1979, 1982, affirming that China is one country and Taiwan is a province of China. These commitments were the political foundation of China's diplomatic relations with the United States and with every country. So it's the US who's broken its promises to not interrupt China's efforts to reunify the island peacefully. China has spent decades developing its economic relations with Taiwan. The trade between the island of Taiwan and mainland China has grown, along with political and cultural relations. But the Pentagon is turning Taiwan into a porcupine, bristling with billions of military equipment. Another $10 billion was just promised. This is why we say Taiwan is a US pawn. There's more than 30 draft bills and resolutions in the US Congress related to Taiwan before the US midterm elections. And they all had one thing in common: to shore up support for Taiwan and to present Taiwan as an independent entity. These congressional bills are promoted by the Washington-based Formosa Association for Public Affairs. And the bills have names such as the Taiwan Invasion Prevention Act, the Arm Taiwan Act, the Taiwan Peace Through Strength Act, and so on. So what's really behind? What is driving this growing hostility and war preparation? It's because China is surpassing the US in GDP and the development of its economy. Today, nearly 2/3 of countries trade more with China than with the United States or any other country. China's growing trade with other countries poses a threat and a challenge to US hegemony. This capitalist system is relentlessly driven to expand or die, and now it is shrinking. So for the multi-billionaires and corporate CEOs, this is a life or death crisis. The ability of China to provide trillions of dollars in development funds means that now developing, formerly colonized countries can have more favorable trade relations without the IMF and World Bank's onerous conditions. This is a threat to every US bank and US-controlled financial institution. Even more dangerous to US power is that China is developing trade relations with countries sanctioned by the United States. And they're doing this by barter and direct currency exchanges. This goes around the almighty, all-powerful US dollar. Today, China and a growing number of countries are in an increasingly stronger position to resist US unequal demands. Countries with 3/4 of the world population refuse to go along with the sanctions on Russia and with a whole array of sanctions. There's sanctions on more than 40 countries. These countries are meeting strategizing together increasingly. While US strategy is sabotage Taiwan and its trade with China by imposing sanctions and finding an excuse to impose those sanctions. The US is provoking conflict to retain hegemony. This desperate imperialist strategy to reverse their declining global position will disrupt the global economy. Presently, Taiwan's trade with China is far bigger than its trade with the United States. Mainland China and Hong Kong account for 42% of Taiwan's exports last year, while the US had only a 15% share. For Taiwan's imports, mainland China and Hong Kong again ranked first with 22% share. The US had only a 10% share, ranking behind Japan, Europe, and Southeast Asia. This is true throughout the region. Actually, South Korea and Japan have greater trade with China than with the US. So the problem for US imperialists is how to reverse this, how to force countries in the Asia Pacific to act against their own economic interests. The US-NATO war in Ukraine was a strategy to impose sanctions on Russia and break the European Union's trade with Russia. 1 year ago, the EU trade with Russia was 10 times the size of EU trade with the US. Sanctions broke that. War in Ukraine has not defeated Russia, but the economies of Europe have suffered greatly. Inflation, recession, supply chain chaos, due to sanctions that has harshly cut into their own market. So US threats and demands to sanction China will also severely damage the economies of Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines. To force high-tech countries to decouple from the People's Republic of China, US imperialism needs a policy and a military crisis with China. And every US plan for sanctions with China starts with a manufactured crisis over Taiwan. In closing, China's long-held position is that cooperation, trade, and development can overcome differences, that it's the only way forward. People's Republic of China has held a consistent, well-understood position on its sovereignty and territorial integrity that is recognized internationally in all world bodies. China has repeatedly asserted its right to resolve this unfinished national reunification. We know that countless US wars have been based on media-hyped lies that the US is defending freedom, democracy, or a small country from an aggressive attack. This is a lie. US wars are for corporate profit. The preparations of US imperialism for a possible war with China, surrounding it with military bases and nuclear weapons and military vessels, is a highly dangerous provocation. We must oppose it, we must mobilize and declare hands off China. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, for very usefully situating us in this current context in which the actors and their interests have to be taken into account. I think this the actors' interests, trade interests, political interests are often forgotten when people are caught in the current discourse, especially of the mainstream media. Okay, next we're gonna have Li Zhenbang speaking.
Okay, could you see my screen?
Yes, but before
my share screen.
Yeah, before you speak, I'll introduce you, Zhenbang.
Yeah, sure.
So Professor Li Zhenbang teaches in Hong Kong Polytechnic University, and he was born in Pingdong, Taiwan, and got his PhD in sociology from the University of Chicago. And he taught at National University of Singapore and also had a postdoctoral fellowship at Harvard Kennedy School. So before entering the academy, he also worked at a community university in Taiwan and participated in several social movement organizations in Taiwan. Now, Zhenbang, it's your turn.
Okay, thanks for Hiron's introduction. And also Sarah has given us a very good opening. So my topic for today is titled, Can We Avoid a War in the Taiwan Strait? And so also like Hiron introduced, I was born in Taiwan and graduated from the National Taiwan University. So that's just like, many Taiwanese, we are quite worried about the situation and the worsening situation. So my points for today's presentation are very simple. I just have 3 points I want to elaborate. The first one is who wants war? The second is what kinds of wars? And the third point I want to elaborate is when is the war? I think that's the most of people are concerned about. Will the war be next year, 2 years later, or something like that? So who wants the war? So my basic point is definitely not Taiwan or Taiwanese, but from my point of view, it's the US and it's a representative, or the so-called, I would term it's the US collaborators. Right now, there are plenty of this kind of the US collaborators in Taiwan. They are in their really primary interest to wage the war and to have the war. And what are the US interests in the war? So as Sarah already introduced, right, that's the US is one of the most militant empires, I would say, in the human history. So the history of the US is a history of war. So I'm not saying without evidence. So that's you can quickly Google this from Wikipedia. So in the very short, like 200 years history, right, that's the US, that's a very, very few years that's without war. So even if the US was not in war, so it was on the road of making profits from war. So there is the several studies conducted in the 1940s and 1950s. Here is just one example from the Thomas Beeson, a journalist, and reported on 1940s. That's before Japan has a Pearl Harbor War. That's the US has made a huge profits from trading with Japan, supporting Japan with a lot of the raw material. That's most of the raw material are supporting Japan's aggression. That's in China. So that's from Thomas Beeson's point, that's the US should be responsible for the very aggressive, the Japanese aggression that's in China. So the potential war in Taiwan served numerous interests from the US side. And Sarah already, elaborated some of the point, right? Interrupting China's development, strengthening its control over its hostage countries like Japan or South Korea, and most importantly, solving its internal capitalist system crisis. So the nature of the war, I will argue that it will be a war between the process of a hegemonic capitalist empire and the rising power with an independent and autonomous political and economic agenda, i.e. China, that try to pursue autonomous and independent economy developing agenda. So I find that's the current situation. That's the Lenin's, that's the 1916 book, Imperialism, the high stage of capitalism, still provide a very, very relevant point to our analysis of today's situation. So that's in this short book, Lenin makes several points, right? The first point is that the monopolization of the global market. Example, the US, for example, that's why the US want to wage the war. That's in the past. The first one is try to monopolize the raw material at the global market, right? So from the early 19th century to 1930s, have almost like 3 decades of the continuous war and the armed conflicts in the Latin America, and later on people call it the Banana War. So, but most of people forget this history. Then I think that the Banana War can be quite relevant, to understand today's the East Asian situation. That's why the US want to wage the war, the trade war against China, especially in the high tech area, right? The second one is the Lenin makes in this book is the emergence of the financial capital that replaced the industrial capital. But there are some new change from Lenin. The first one is, I would say, is a complication of the international financial system, e.g. the introduction of the national bond in the US. So that's also the creation of the so-called the US dollar hegemony, right? And we know this. So the US survived through the debts that purchased by the war, and in this kind of circulation of the dollar, that's to sustain the dollar system. But the new empire, e.g. US, doesn't fully rely on the physical occupation like the old empire. Although the US still de facto occupy and control many foreign countries of society. I would say right now, US is not only use this kind of the invincible armed force or the physical force, but it's also rely on what I call is the empire of the mind, right? The US is a new empire built upon Winston Churchill's idea. The empire of the future is the empire of the mind. So how does the US achieve this in the global and especially in Taiwan from a Taiwanese point? The first is through the pro-US regime's government propaganda. The second one is through the mass media and the so-called public opinion survey. So there are plenty of the public opinion survey conducted every day in Taiwan and try to convey a point. That's how Taiwanese want to support the US the strategies in defending weaponizing Taiwan. And the third one is through the higher education, especially social science. So that's I was in this field, so I know that's how certain kind of topic are especially preferred that's to be taught in the school, like democracy and what the bright side democracy can bring, the US style democracy can bring to the Taiwan, to the Taiwanese people, and how China as a opposing kind of in the countering side that's serve as the negative point. And the fourth one is through its dominance in the value commodity chain of technology. So that's because of the time limits, I cannot really elaborate or expand this point, but the TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, relocation to the US several months ago. That is one of this kind of example that's through kind of monopolizing on the upper string of the commodity chain that the US are able to force some of the this kind of global the company that's locating at the lower string and to relocate to the US. So it creates an ideological effect. So for many Taiwanese people, as far as I know, and as many people I was kind of talking with, there is a kind of ideology. The first is the US is invincible. There's no one. Many people can say that the PLA, People's Liberation Army, is really weak because they lack of experience. But no one will really talk about that the US is kind of can be defeated. There's no one really in Taiwan really believe this point. The second point is that the US is democratic and therefore peaceful, just, and free. I think that many Taiwanese believe this, and so that's whenever that you want to say that China provide some of the values that Sarah offer to us at the open remark. That China bring a more like an independent developing strategy, or China's democracy is actually centered upon the egalitarian principle, but no one really believes this. That's from Taiwan side. And however, this ideological effect need material base to support, e.g. the higher education system, the mass media propaganda machine. So my third point, when is the war? From my perspective, I will argue the war has already begun. So because that's in Taiwan, that's there is plenty of right now at the current time, there's plenty of the ideological cognitive war against China. So one of the very popular ways to, for this kind of cognitive war is stigmatization. So for example, they will use some like dirty words to quote Chinese. And so that's in this way, they demoralize China. And even so, try to link China with some of the barbarian, kind of tribal, some of the insects, such as this, and spreading rumors. So there's kind of the plan every day that if you turn on the TV, turn on the TV program, you will see a lot of the mainstream TV program that's spreading a rumor. For example, on the bottom right side, there is the mainstream newspaper that's always every summer they were spreading a rumor saying the Three Gorge Dam will be broken. But for several of years, you know, the three Gorge dams are still there. And third one is downplaying the development of China. So that's how, you know, they tell the people they don't trust, you know, the development, the economic development of China. The government statistic of the Chinese from China is unreliable. So even skepticism on the US is not allowed. It's a reason political, you know, kind of campaign. There's one of the candidates. That's the potential presidential candidate. That's next year. That's say that Taiwanese should not stop the US because the US is the only country we can rely on. So he said that all of the people like me, if I say something bad to the US, I'm not trustworthy. So he announced this point. Probably. So since the cognitive war has already begun, so the next is to follow US suggestion to enhance Taiwan's own defensive power. For example, the increase in military spending that we already see in the past several years, and the extension of the military conscription 2 months ago from 3 months to 1 year. Some people will believe that we'll extend this to even 1.5 years or 2 years. But China never says that it has a clear schedule of military action, but it is the US that always release the potential date of the China will invade Taiwan. For example, there you can find plenty of this kind of the prediction from the US side, 2025, 2027, or before 2030. So you will see plenty of this kind of prediction that's by different kind of think tank or by the Defense Department. So my last thought, can Taiwan and China resist the US war invitation? Like the case in the Ukraine, the US may use abnormal procedures to involve tension, right? The bombing of the Nord Stream. So there are potential way US could, you know, force Taiwan or force China to be in a war or to be in a conflict. I think that it's quite possible, and many people predict this. But actually, we don't know what is the place if US want to choose this kind of the method. The second point, the second thought is that can the US president really control the US military industrial complex? I really, you know, doubt this point because it's from a lot of, you know, the kind of the clue that I really doubt that the US, you know, the politician can control this kind of the huge MIC. So the US style democracy has become anti-democracy. And I think this point is quite has a deep roots among many Chinese people, especially in recent years, seeing the kind of the heightening irrational anti-Chinese sentiment by the US politician. And the US MIC is anti-human, and from my point is anti-civilization. So it's try to, you know, expand its military influence, and also in the way to create a circulation of the US dollar. So the East Asia NATO, I think that it's quite possible because Japan and South Korea has shown the interest to join or to build the East Asia NATO. And my last thought is that can China offer an alternative view of the future world to the global society will be the key that's in this kind of the prolonging or lengthening kind of the struggle kind of the battle against the US. So the reunion, but that's my own perspective, is that the reunion of Taiwan to China will be the new step in China's long quest since the 18th century, because Taiwan officially was forced to the so-called global market or so-called global capitalist system is by the unequal treaty of the Tianjin Treaty. That's after 1950s. So it's almost 200 years. And I think that's from many Chinese people point or perspective is the liberation of the reunion of Taiwan really marks a new beginning of this past 200 years of the colonial history. And although the semi-colonial history or something, this kind of the very, very sad history that China is always under the kind of the foreign force, the aggression. That's my point. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Zhenbang, for sharing your thoughts on the issue, providing us with a lot of data to think about. And our next speaker would be Professor Alan Borsat. And he is having some issue today, so he couldn't actually come to us to this panel, virtual panel, in person, quote unquote. So he has produced a video for us to watch. Professor Borsat is a Professor Emeritus at the Department of Philosophy of Paris 8 University, and he has been a visiting professor in Taiwan for 8 years at primarily 2 universities in Taiwan. One is at Taiwan Hsinchu Jiaotong University, the other is Taiwan Chenggong University. And he has co-authored with Juan Alberto Ruiz Casado of Treasure Island, the discursive struggle for Taiwan in the midst of the new Cold War, which is coming out, which came out in 2022. And in the video that we're going to watch, he will mainly discuss the discourse or discourses of occupations in Taiwan. And some of the occupations are historical, and some of the occupations are imagined. And some of the occupations people may be aware and actually experienced. And it is one occupation he specifically would discuss, which is the mental occupation. Zhenbang, can you share the video?
Hello, everyone. I'm not well. This is why I have to content myself to send you this video. Sorry for that. I would like to deliver some thoughts on the concept of occupation, as it seems to be a solid element of continuity in discourse practices around the signifier Taiwan today, where generally more or less radical discontinuities prevail. I mean that the specter of occupation haunts the discourse and representations that are arranged around the name of Taiwan itself, in the same sense that Marx and Engels say at the beginning of the Communist Manifesto that a specter haunts Europe, that of communism. Or we would say that an immemorial specter haunts the life of the people on or of this island, Taiwan, the specter of subalternity. The property of a specter, of a ghost, however, as Jacques Derrida forcefully reminded us in Spectres of Marx, is to maintain complicated relationships with reality. It is at once an image, a fantasy, and therefore, in that sense, what opposes the really real, the present object of the living. But it is not non-existent and inoperative either. It is the presence of an absence in its effectiveness and its efficiency itself. In this capacity, it produces effects that can be considerable, decisive on reality in its dynamic structure. The specter of communism has overturned the course of European and global history throughout the second half of the 19th century and the long 20th century. No Chinese revolution, among others, without the specter of communism. The spectral power of the word occupation is easily identified in all sorts of accounts about the island's past, very popular today and more or less clearly placed under the sign of the doxa of independence. The idea, obviously simplifying, the making into a tale or the manufacturing into a tale or a plot of the island's history as a succession of occupations, the Manchu, the Japanese, the Kuomintang, and today the famous threat, always more oppressive and imminent, weighing on the island, the threat of a Chinese, a communist and totalitarian occupation. Here we see that what the spectral is made of, that is, elements of the present borrowed from the real
Zhenbang, I see the
States, reinforced by their local allies and other, intertwined with images and phantasmagorias borrowed in turn from that immemorial victimism with indistinct contours, the unfortunate islander constantly subjected to the appetites and violence of successive and uninterrupted occupation. This is what Claude Lévi-Strauss would call bricolage, but it works. The discourse bubble around the Chinese threat that never stops inflating today has this phantasmatic or phantasmagorial coloring, the nightmare of the occupation of occupations, the most terrible of all, the mother of occupations, compared to which, that is the Chinese occupation, the coming Chinese occupation, of course, compared to which the half-century of Japanese colonization of the island would be like a harmless parenthesis. The first would be that, in reality, what is commonly referred to as an occupation is often much more complicated than the simple violence exerted by an external force on a submitted population. The second is often also true, an occupation that an occupation can hide another. The plot of the current condition of the island by the pro-independence narrative, increasingly noisy and uninhibited, is arranged around this figure. For a long time, if not forever, we Taiwanese, have been occupied and exposed to the threat of occupation. Let's finally be ourselves, free, independent, return to our own original identity, which endlessly revolves around this pure tautology. Taiwan is Taiwan and nothing else. But this narrative, of course, is a fable. It is entirely sewn with white threads. What the island is made of course, in its finest grain, both in terms of its population and its territories, its landscapes even, is inextricably linked to the succession and stratification of the supposed occupation. Occupiers, or those designated as such, are generally not simple barbarian invaders who, like the Huns, flood the country, loot it, leave it to fire and blood, and then go back home on their little horses, on the back of their little horses. Even colonization, defined here as systematic and lasting occupation, combines looting and development. This is particularly true here, in Taiwan, with the Japanese occupation. Occupation in this sense contributes to shaping what the identity of the occupied is made of, and the succession of occupations, or supposed alleged ones, is a factory of composite identities, especially when accompanied by migrations and population transfers, which was massively the case on this island in different phases of its history. And then all occupations have differential features. The occupation or colonization of Taiwan by the Japanese does not present the same face at all for the indigenous populations who resisted with the energy of despair, and for the Han elites whose children went to study in Japan and sometimes returned as doctors, engineers, writers writing in Japanese, etc. This means, in simple terms, that an occupation is never only physical, it is also mental. It does not only take the form, the shape of a physical, military, administrative, police violence exercised by a force. It also proceeds by investment and transformation of mentalities, behaviors, collective habits, and subjectivities. It induces a new way of life. It shapes populations and their ways of thinking and acting. The more it is lasting, and the more the occupation presents itself as a crucible and a mold, it produces acculturation and hybridization. This is the Japanese sequence of Taiwan from this angle, and just as much the establishment on the island of the administration and army of the so-called defeated Nationalist Party, Kuomintang, during the Chinese Civil War on the mainland. In continuation of these observations, the issue I would like to encourage you to reflect on is that of an occupation that would not follow a military conquest, the presence of a foreign administration, or a forced submission to a foreign power, but would essentially result from a seizure, a mental and ideological grip, and would manifest itself not in the form of violent open domination, but in a subservience that is all the more tenacious because it is insidious and subliminal, unconscious, what I would call, in a somewhat provocative expression, a mental occupation. To put things abruptly, the more I stay in Taiwan and observe both political mores of the ruling elites and the mentalities of the intellectual caste, or even the way in which ordinary people generally see the world and act accordingly, and the more I would be inclined to assert this. The more Taiwan dreams or fantasizes around the theme of independence, the more it is under the grip of a mental occupation. Taiwan is not under occupation like Okinawa, obviously. There are no US military personnel in uniform in the streets. But the desire for such an occupation, aimed at protecting the island from the Chinese threat, is increasingly being heard. That is what I call a mental occupation. Without this context, the haunting motif of the Chinese threat, the nightmare of a Chinese occupation, is first and foremost the fantasy of the mentally occupied before anything else. A fantasy is an image that interposes itself between a human subject and reality, and which produces a variably distorted perception of the reality, of that reality. If you look at the present situation of Taiwan from this angle, lots of things that appear, let's say, strange or even preposterous become crystal clear. For example, the endless palaver around bilingualism, that is, how English should become the second language of each and every Taiwanese in a few years. That kind of daydreaming is a blatant symptom of the mental occupation, that is, of the ascendancy, that is, the hold exerted by the invisible hand of the hegemon on the local daydreamers. To understand the current situation, it is necessary to start by identifying where the divide between reality and fantasy occurs. In this case, reality is shaped and fashioned by the mental occupation of Taiwan, and conversely. If you want to know the name, the face, and the address of the occupier, please just read Taipei Times and its Chinese language equivalents, and you will be informed. However, fantasy is not just an inconsequential daydream. It is to align with its visions and obsessions. It is an automaton that manufactures self-fulfilling prophecies. And this is exactly what all those who live and work under the shadow of the nightmare of China's occupation of the island are doing today, multiplying irresponsible actions, provocations, faits accomplis, intended to make the Chinese leaders lose patience. The fantasy, in this sense, is always driven by a death wish, that is an obscure wish for war, obviously, in that case. Thank you.
Okay, that's Professor Bossert. And I noticed that in the chat, one member of the audience had asked a question that what's most important is the agency of Taiwanese people. What I think that's interesting in the video that we have just watched is Professor Bossert had raised a very important question. That is, agency is ability to act upon and to change reality. But his point is between reality and agency, we have to understand how that's been mediated. And he would argue that that mediation, in most of the cases, we have to think about fantasy. So I think on this question, we'll have more to discuss after all the speakers had their turn to speak. All right. Next, we're going to have Professor Dick Low from SOAS. Professor Low is reader in economics at SOAS, University of London. He was formerly chair of the Center of Chinese Studies at SOAS. He's also a member of the Center for Comparative Political Economy at Renmin University of China. He was visiting professor at Chinese University of Hong Kong and Waseda University in Japan. And Professor Low teaches undergraduate and postgraduate courses on Chinese economy, development economics, and microeconomics. His research interest includes China's economic transformation, industrialization, going out, and the political economy of globalization. And he's widely published author, and he's also written on a wide range of topics and commentaries on China's political economy, including political developments in Hong Kong and Taiwan. And Professor Lau himself grew up in Taiwan and has plenty of his own life experience in relation to Hong Kong. Okay, now it's your turn, Professor Lau.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps I can share the screen with you first. Okay, so hope that you can see the screen now. Now, perhaps I can start with a few words on the moral of these presentations. If a war over Taiwan should erupt, the Chinese people need international solidarity and support from people across the world, not least the left in Western countries that is oriented towards anti-imperialism. Unfortunately, such is not very likely to come about in view of the relevant international discourses thus far, and as has been demonstrated by the responses to the events in Hong Kong. Information deficiency and asymmetry is an issue, especially due to the hegemony of Western media. But more important is the issue of worldviews, where many in political and intellectual left seem to have succumbed to the politics of universal values, which is mistaken as universal values themselves. It is therefore the motivation of this presentation to critically engage with the concerned worldviews with respect to the questions of Hong Kong and Taiwan. Now, Hong Kong and Taiwan loom large in the international discourses over the question of the progressiveness or otherwise of Chinese political economy. The question ultimately concerns the sovereignty of the Chinese people versus varieties of local self-determination. Fundamentally, the people as a historical category needs justification. And this presentation is purported to provide some pointers for answering the questions. It takes as its starting point the proposition that in the modern world, the historical justice of the category, the people, is most critically determined by anti-imperialism. Imperialism entails northern capital exploiting and suppressing southern labor. Anti-imperialism at the level of determining the people, therefore, signifies endeavors of resisting systematically the hegemonic world order of capitalism. Now, the formation of the Chinese people and its evolution to date can be justifiably considered as such an endeavor. Any advocacy of an actual conduct of pushing for local self-determination for Hong Kong and Taiwan needs to be assessed in terms of their relative historical justice vis-a-vis the Chinese people. Now, to be more precise, we need to look at the broader historical context and situate the Taiwan and Hong Kong question in this context. From the perspective of the Chinese people, that China has always insisted that pre-1997 Hong Kong was an occupied region, that is, denouncing the legality of the treaties that set Hong Kong to Britain's. Early on, in fact, in the 1970s, a contest between a vast majority of countries in the world versus the Western Bloc resulted in China successfully getting the UN to take out Hong Kong from the list of colonies. The justification for China's position is that the legality of outright colonialism, imperialism, which was essential to the world order of what's known as Pax Britannica, is null and void. This is revolutions overthrowing legal arrangements. It is enshrined in the UN Charter, which denounces outright colonialism, imperialism. Well, about Taiwan, the same principles applies. It was deemed an occupied region pre-1945 because the treaty with which China ceded Taiwan to Japan was essentially part of Pax Britannica. And this position of China was confirmed in the Potsdam Declaration. It was a promise made by the Allies to the Chinese people that were at that time devoting their maximum efforts and sacrifices to sustain the war against the Axis. Similar promises of denouncing outright colonialism, imperialism of Pax Britannica were made to the rest of the non-Western world in the form of the UN Charter. The US reneged on the promises in 1950, following the Chinese Revolution. Hence, the US Navy blocking Taiwan Strait, the exclusion of China in the formulation and signing of the Treaty of San Francisco, the US-Taiwan military alliance, etc. And in that context, Taiwan politics evolved progressively from anti-communist to anti-communist plus anti-China. In fact, the pro-unification left wings that dominated Taiwan society in the late 1940s and early 1950s was bloodily wiped out. But nevertheless, the New World Order, known as Pax Americana, is not the kind of outright colonialism, imperialism that has been cast aside by the world. Its dominance and resistance are still ongoing. Thus, in addition to revolution overthrowing legal arrangements, legality is still a real issue of context. That is why China has also been stressing the legality of the Potsdam Declaration and denouncing the Treaty of San Francisco on legal grounds. Now, a further complexity and with even more powerful ramifications of Pax Americana concerns the contested interpretation of the principle of the UN Charter. Ultimately, what is meant by democracy and therefore self-determination? After all, democracy means the supreme authority resting with the people. So the premise of democracy is the people well-defined and formed on the basis of sufficient historical justice. Now, the existing Hong Kong people and Taiwan people, insofar as they stand in contrast to the Chinese people, were formed historically on the basis of being delineated by the military forces of Pax Britannica and Pax Americana, respectively. And the Taiwan people is today still defined by a US internal legislation, the Taiwan Relations Act. So you can see the supreme authority rests with a foreign master. What kind of justice this can be? And then also remember that self-determination is an act of exclusion, which in the case of Hong Kong and Taiwan inevitably entails local residents attempting to deprive the right or the sovereignty of the Chinese people. And at this point, of course, we need to go deeper to look at the possible historical justice for the Chinese people. The formation of the Chinese people is through the revolution of the 20th century against world capitalism. And this historical category, judged by the principles of the UN Charter, is far more justified compared with the world order under the American Empire, let alone the world order under the British Empire. And the historical process involves the sacrifices by tens of millions, and its level of justice is also therefore also much higher than the willingness or the identification of any part of the Chinese people, including any part or even the total of the existing people in Hong Kong and Taiwan. Now, is the Chinese people still sufficiently justified nowadays relative to the universal values embodied in the UN Charter or the actual practices of the US empires, which I call the politics of universal values? And also, is historical justice associated with the Chinese people necessarily far more important, so much so as to disregard the specificity of Hong Kong, Taiwan history and society? Now, here we can recall a very famous quotation from his first UN speech in 1971 by the former foreign minister of China, Qiu Guanhua, that countries want independence, nations want liberation, and the people want revolution. This has become an irresistible trend of history. So central to this quotation is the people, of which the working class is the mainstay. They want revolution for undoing the exploitation and suppression imposed by world capitalism. The Chinese Revolution has its origin back to the Shanghai May 30th movement and the Great Guangzhou Hong Kong strike in the 1920s. And this is the first time the Chinese working class entered the political stage. It also signifies the objective of the Hong Kong community as part of the Chinese people. And the objective of this revolution was to bring down the social and power relations imposed by actually existing capitalism, that is imperialism. So historical capitalism that has always had its systemic capital accumulation based on the exploitation of labor, especially the working class of the underdeveloped world. And the nature of the Chinese Revolution is such that it has always aspired to establish a new framework of social power relations that transcends historical capitalism in terms of justice, that is empowering the Chinese people to resist the exploitation and suppression of the systemic capital accumulation of historical capitalism. And the revolution is still an unfinished project to date. As such, the project is infused with different kinds of historical complexities. Now, the complexities concerns the governments in China and the possible appeal to the communities in Taiwan and Hong Kong, and even more fundamentally, China as an entity in terms of its nationhood. So these are precisely the focal points of the debate over the status and the future prospects for Hong Kong in relation to the mainland. Although this not at all in and around in Taiwan. Now, because of time the limits, so I would skip the details on these issues. But what I want to move on to talk about is the some given what we have, what I have just raised, the issues they have just raised, I would therefore come to the judgment that democratic reunion in the sense of building a Hong Kong that is intrinsic to building a China that transcends historical capitalism, which is the most promising prospects for the not just for Hong Kong and Taiwan, but for China itself, the main China as a whole. However, unfortunately, this has never had a chance since its first emergence as a slogan in Hong Kong in the early 1980s, and a similar slogan being raised by the pro-unification left in Taiwan, roughly also since the same times, early 1980s. But in both regions, they have never been the chance to put into practice. So in the first place, in Hong Kong as well as in Taiwan, this was because of colonialities. In the case of Hong Kong, the dominant political forces in Hong Kong have been antithetical to the orientation of making the Hong Kong community part of the Chinese Revolution. It was also, to some extent, due to the pragmatist approach of the Chinese leadership towards Hong Kong, so that decolonization has never been contemplated. Now, a little bit more details, as we note, the 2019 anti-extradition bill movement, in terms of its mainstreams, can be seen as the combination of this antithetical orientation. It opposed to not only making Hong Kong people as part of the Chinese people, but also to the validity of the concept or the category of the Chinese people altogether. It was totally unrelated to the question raised above concerning the relative justice between the demand for democratic self-governing by the local communities versus the protection of sovereignty by the Chinese people. And it exhibited a strong character of siding with, indeed, playing up to the hegemony of the capitalist world order. And all these elements are clearly evidenced in the case of Taiwan. All the major political forces have been antithetical to the orientation of making the local community a part of the Chinese people and part of the Chinese Revolution. It was totally unrelated to the question concerning democratic self-governing versus the sovereignty of the Chinese people. And it was actually characterized by siding with, indeed playing up with to the hegemony of the capitalist world order. So all this notwithstanding, even the discussion above on the realism and justice, there seems no conceivable alternative to democratic reunion for both Hong Kong and Taiwan. People truly concerned with the future of the communities need to start the project afresh. So let me stop at this point. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Lo, for bringing us to a new understanding of sovereignty, which has been so far being elided in much of this discussion about Taiwan as well. Okay, so next we're going to have our final speaker, Ben Norton. He's a journalist and analyst. He's the founder and editor-in-chief of the independent media outlet, Geopolitical Economy Report. He has reported from many countries around the world and is based in Latin America. Ben, now it's your floor.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being here. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. The topic for discussion today is whether or not there's going to be a war over Taiwan. Unfortunately, I do think there will be some kind of violent conflict. We all don't want a war to happen, but if we listen to the extremely aggressive rhetoric from the US government, and particularly the US military, they have made it clear that they want to wage war over Taiwan. And I'm going to start today looking at a comment, a very aggressive and irresponsible comment made just recently by a US general. This was published in late January. A top US general said that he expects the US military will wage war with China as soon as 2025. It's a 4-star US Air Force general, Mike Minahan. He said in a memo that is an internal memo that my gut tells me we will fight in 2025. And he also instructed his soldiers that they need to learn how to train to kill people as effectively as possible. And of course, the Pentagon intentionally downplayed the severity of this threat. You could say it's part of maybe the Mad Men strategy. It was a controlled leaked. But if you look at the statements officially made by Pentagon leadership, they don't inspire much more confidence. we should look at the National Defense Strategy that was published by the Pentagon this October. The Wall Street Journal published an article summarizing it, saying U.S. defense strategy casts China as greatest danger to American security. And this is significant because in 2018, the Pentagon published its new national defense strategy that for the first time changed the transition from the so-called war on terror, in which the U.S. claimed that non-state so-called terrorism was the top threat to U.S. national security. They transitioned to saying that so-called great power competition is the main threat to U.S. national security. That was under Secretary of Defense James Mattis. Now under Lloyd Austin, they have further revised it and said China specifically is the top threat. And the Wall Street Journal says that very clearly. Lloyd Austin wrote, quote, "The People's Republic of China remains our most consequential strategic competitor for the coming decades." And the Wall Street Journal noted that this national defense strategy came just after the White House released its own national security strategy, which was very similar. And it said that China is the main threat, although they used the term competitor. And they did say that Russia, the defense strategy in the Pentagon did say that Russia is an acute threat, but they said that in the medium to the long term, China is the biggest so-called threat. And if we look at the actions that the Pentagon has been taking, we can see that it is preparing for some kind of violent conflict. Nikkei published an important article, this is the Japanese newspaper, back in 2021 that unfortunately did not get much attention, but it is quite shocking. And that is that the US military plans on spending $27 billion within the next 5 years to put an offensive missile network on the first island chain. They said that this was part of the proposal that US Indo-Pacific Command, that's the US military's command, sent to Congress, and it includes the authorization of $27.4 billion to be spent in the Indo-Pacific theater. And if you look here, I mean, for people who don't know, I'm sure most people here do, but the first island chain includes Japan, the Philippines, and of course, Taiwan, which is part of the People's Republic of China, but I'll come back to that in a second. The US military and NATO have said very clearly they want to turn Taiwan into what they call a prickly porcupine, and I'll talk about that strategy in a second. But the strategy is to put these $27 billion worth of offensive missiles networks in Japan, especially Okinawa, also the Philippines, and the Philippines plays a key role in this as well. I'll come back to that because the U.S. just signed an agreement with the Philippines to provide access to 4 new military bases. I'll come back to that in a moment here. But I should note that the RAND Corporation, which is the main Pentagon think tank, they did publish a report over a year ago complaining that they were having difficulty getting the governments in certain countries in the Pacific to agree to hosting these missile networks. Specifically, they named Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines. But the recent change of governments in all 3 of those countries has made it look like the U.S. may get them to agree to host these missile networks, especially Fumio Kishida, the new Japanese leader, just took a trip to Washington and met with President Biden, and they agreed to more military cooperation. Japan is militarizing now at the highest level it has since World War II. And then I mentioned, the Philippines signed this new military agreement, and also South Korea's new leader is taking a harder line against China as well. So this plays into another shocking report that was published in the Financial Times on January 8th. I mean, many of these reports are very recent, and we can see this aggressive posturing being taken by Washington in a short period of time. This article is titled, U.S. Military Deepens Ties with Japan and Philippines to Prepare for So-Called China Threat. But it emphasizes, again, the role that Japan is playing in these war preparations and how the Japanese so-called defense forces are really heavily militarizing. And it quotes a lieutenant general from the U.S. Marines named James Bierman, who said that the U.S. and the Japanese militaries have, quote, seen exponential increases just over the last year. So it shows that Kishida is taking a more aggressive line. And they said that they're specifically emulating the groundwork that has enabled Western countries to support Ukraine in the proxy war against Russia. That's an important point that I'm going to come back to in a moment here. And I mentioned the importance, in addition to Japan, but the importance of the Philippines. And the BBC put this very clearly in a report where they boasted, you could say that this British state media is exaggerating a little bit, of course, but they did boast, quote, U.S. secures deal on basis to complete arc around China. Not mincing words, it's clear that this is about surrounding China with hostile military forces. And this BBC report said, the way they put it, the U.S. has secured access to 4 additional military bases in the Philippines. And they say Washington has stitched the gap in the arc of U.S. alliances stretching from South Korea and Japan in the north down to Australia in the south. The missing link had been the Philippines. And, the new president of the Philippines, Bongbong Marcos, who, of course, is the son of the former U.S.-backed dictator of the Philippines, Marcos, who had been a key ally in the first Cold War. That China had been trying to work diplomatically to maintain positive relations with Bongbong Marcos. He had made comments suggesting that he wasn't going to take an aggressive line against China. It does seem that he is trying to balance the U.S. and China and doing what's in the Philippines' own national interests. But the fact that he allowed the U.S. to access 4 new bases in the Philippines is a concerning sign that, he may go along with this U.S. strategy, not only to encircle China, but essentially to wage war on China. And finally, when I say that the U.S. is preparing to wage war on China, of course, I hope it doesn't do so. I hope that there can be possibilities met to prevent it. But I'm simply looking at what the U.S. ruling class itself is saying. And again, maybe this is all part of a sophisticated psychological warfare strategy, going back, to Richard Nixon. They called it the madman strategy. Potentially, this is all an attempt to try to threaten China, to try to bring about some kind of diplomacy that, of course, China has always been the one willing to engage in diplomatic talks. It's the U.S. that opposes diplomacy. But this brings me to the last series of articles that I want to look at today, which was published by Foreign Policy, which makes it clear. This is the voice of the political class in Washington, Foreign Policy magazine. And the way they put it, they say that this is lessons. They're discussing lessons for the next war. And they have 12 experts. This was published in January, 12 experts, including former top U.S. officials, NATO officials, and others, discussing their strategy for waging war with China in order to support secessionism, separatism in Taiwan. And when they say lessons for the next war, they're saying lessons from the current war, which is the proxy war against Russia in Ukraine, and applying those lessons for U.S. war against China over Taiwan. And some of the people who contributed to this include Anders Fogh Rasmussen, who's the former NATO Secretary General in the Obama era. It also includes David Petraeus, the former top U.S. general who oversaw the war strategy and counterinsurgency strategy in Afghanistan. And of course, David Petraeus was CIA director. And Anne-Marie Slaughter, the aptly named neoconservative former State Department official under Obama, who's never seen a war she didn't like. So they begin this series making very clear that they're preparing for war. And they open it with a bang with the former NATO Secretary General, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, who talks about the importance of turning Taiwan into a bristling porcupine. And he makes a few main points in this article. And this is the way that the U.S. ruling class is discussing how to wage a war over strategy to support separatism in Taiwan. One, they talk about learning the parallels between the proxy war in Ukraine and the imperialist war over Taiwan. And they say, he uses this ridiculous rhetoric of the so-called free world, but he stresses the importance of learning lessons from the war in Ukraine. And he said that that Taiwan needs to have a technological superiority. And he argues that in the proxy war over Ukraine, the way that Ukraine has been able to resist thus far, although he exaggerates the extent to which Ukraine has been resisting, he does say that it's been able to do that largely because of superior Western-made weapons. So he argues that the U.S. needs to provide Taiwan with as many advanced armaments and missile systems as possible. And he says that, of course, part of this is also the economic warfare, which I'll come back to in a second. He says it's crucial that the U.S. provides the most advanced microchips and machinery, and prevents China from having access to that technology. And that explains the US strategy that Biden administration applying very aggressive sanctions against China, preventing the export to China of advanced microchips, quantum computing technology. And he also talks about China's reliance on global supply chains. And he talks about the importance of bringing in allies. Specifically, he names South Korea and Japan. And he notes that China is more dependent on global supply chains than Russia had been, largely because Russia since 2014 has been trying to make its economy sanctions proof. So he talks about one of the areas of China's vulnerabilities being the supply chain. And then he says, again, weapons are what counts. Sanctions are important, but the US needs to turn Taiwan into a porcupine bristling with armaments. So this is the military strategy. And then the second article in the series is about the economic warfare strategy. And it's by a researcher at this neoconservative think tank, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, which is funded by Western governments and the weapons industry. And her name is Maria Shagina. And she talks about the strategies for economic warfare against China. And we're seeing that exactly. And again, this explains the Biden strategy for its economic warfare against China. Many people asked, why is Biden going so aggressively against the Chinese tech sector, especially considering that, China has already made advancements in the past few months after Biden imposed these sanctions. China has already made advancements in chip technology, but they make it clear that the strategy is that they know China can make up for this technology, but they're imposing these sanctions now because this might give them 2 or 3 years to prepare for war over Taiwan. And then maybe by 4 or 5 years, China will have completely caught up and probably be even more advanced in its technological sector. So this article, again, in Foreign Policy Magazine, argues the importance of sanctions and economic, technological, and military advantages over both Russia and China. She also stresses the point that unlike Russia, China is more vulnerable because of how deeply embedded it is in the global economy and supply chains. And she argues that cutting ties with China could turn into the economic version of nuclear war, mutually assured destruction. So instead, the West needs to identify choke points and decreasing vulnerabilities that China has. And they also talk about the importance of a broad coalition. And she says that it was very important to freeze the $300 billion in foreign exchange reserves that was held by the Russian bank. And part of that was also, part of the goal is also to cut off Russia's access to Western technology. So they're learning from those same strategies they used against Russia to try to think about how they could implement it against China, although she acknowledges that this would be significantly more difficult against China, considering it has the world's largest economy measured according to purchasing power parity. So it's about stifling, she says very clearly, the goal is to stifle China's ability to advance its capabilities in emerging technologies. She speaks openly of the West's weaponization of finance, saying clearly that these international financial institutions are weapons. They're not independent. And she notes that China is itself conscious of its weakest spot, its high reliance on dollars and other Western currencies for international trade and foreign reserves. And this brings us to why China has been trying to reduce its exposure to dollars, trying to decrease its holdings of US Treasury securities. And she refers to this as China's financial decoupling. She speaks about the digitalization of the yuan and China's attempt to reduce dollar dependency. And she says that Western financial sanctions have given Chinese efforts a boost in their attempt to increase the internationalization of the yuan and to sanction-proof the economy of China and its allies. So they understand that this is a race for time. I mean, that's why I think this general said that the US is potentially going to be at war over Taiwan by 2025, because they understand that China does have these weaknesses in terms of short-term technological weaknesses and short-term reliance on the US dollar. So I think a lot of members of the US ruling class in Washington have made the assessment that they need to strike sooner rather than later before China can develop its tech sector, sufficiently to be independent and before it can sufficiently develop new financial architecture that will weaken its dependence on the US dollar. And I'm not going to go through the other articles because there's many. I'll just briefly mention that David Petraeus himself, you know, the leader of the former CIA director, military leader who was a key strategist for counterinsurgency. I mean, he says clearly that the US goal is to defend the US-led world order. I mean, he says it very clearly. It's not about democracy. It's not about human rights. He doesn't even say the rules-based order. He says the US-led world order. And he complains that China, Russia, and Iran are trying to keep the United States out of their respective backyards. I mean, again, we see this. This is the ideology of the military class in Washington, which is full spectrum dominance, the Wolfowitz doctrine, unipolar hegemony of the entire planet. And he talks specifically about the strategy of anti-access area denial, A2AD, and how it was applied with the proxy war in Ukraine against Russia. And he says that the Western Pacific is very different from from Ukraine. It's predominantly maritime, encompassing vastly greater distances and contested by combatants with far more technologically advanced capabilities. So he argues that China is more advanced than Russia's military, although they are strategic partners and working together closely. And then here, just this final word I'll say is that David Petraeus argued that in the event of conflict, that is war over Taiwan, no one will come to the rescue of an understocked US military that runs out of munition. So he says that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been an invaluable wake-up call for a new arms race, essentially. He says that Pentagon planners and congressional appropriators need to provide the defense industry with large sums of money to provide the ability to maintain sustained warfare in a new era of great power competition. So I'll end there. I mean, again, the topic to the question we were analyzing today is whether or not there's going to be a war over Taiwan. I mean, again, this could all be part of a sophisticated psychological war that the US is waging, but I think you have to conclude, if you study what the ruling class is saying very clearly, they are preparing for war with China in order to support separatism in Taiwan, and they're preparing to do it in the short term.
Thanks very much, Ben, for sharing and keeping us very much up to date to the situation, to the discourses anyway, about by the US ruling elites on the question of war. Now we have all 5 speakers have shared their views, and the floor is now open for questions and discussions. I encourage people to actually ask your questions by turn on your mic. But of course, if it's not convenient for you to do so, you can ask your questions in chat. And also, I think the speakers can also ask each other questions if you do have questions. I can see one hand up. You can turn on your mic.
Yeah, greetings from Frankfurt, Germany. 2 questions really. Sarah Flounders talked about the interdependence of the Chinese or mainland Chinese economy with Taiwan, or is it the other way around? Taiwan is very much dependent on its trade, etc., with China. If that is the case, and I believe it is, why then does the ruling elite in Taiwan seem hell-bent on militarization of the island, on entering conflict with mainland China, with the People's Republic of China? That's one question. Something I don't understand. There seems to be lots of contradictory forces, presumably among the ruling class in Taiwan itself. If somebody could, if Sarah or somebody else can explain something about this, I'd be very happy. On the point which Ben Norton just made, like most of the contributions this evening or today, wherever you are, I found extremely interesting, but they all seem to tend towards the inevitability of war taking place. Yeah? And either it's a very, sophisticated psychological warfare, which Ben talked about, or do other people on the panel think that this war is really going to take place? Do you think it's unavoidable, unstoppable, and inevitable? No? Thank you very much.
Okay, 2 questions. Any member from the panel who wants to address these questions?
Can just quickly speak in response to the 2 questions. Now, the first question concerning the economic interdependence, my perception of my impression, I think should be right, is that ever since the year 1993 and all the way up until now, Taiwan has been running trade surplus with the rest of the world. But if its trade surplus with the mainland, including Hong Kong, is excluded, then Taiwan would have been running trade deficits with the rest of the world all the way from 1993 up until now. Right? So you can see the economic dependence. Right? Taiwan is a very much export-oriented economy and with such a trade relationship with the mainland. And my understanding, which I'm not very sure, is that for quite a long period of time, the mainland's Beijing's leadership's policy is to promote cross-strait economic relationship as a means for, if not for promoting reunification, at least for the providing some possible means for avoiding the showdowns or avoiding the direct conflicts. So that policy doesn't seem to work by now, meaning that even with all these economic benefits, there is no possibility of reversing Taiwan politics, moving increasingly towards confrontation, towards the separatism. So that is the situation. My understanding of the situation. How to assess it is another question. Now, concerning the inevitability or otherwise of war, I think there's nothing inevitable in the real world, but still I'm quite pessimistic about whether a war can be avoided, given the fact that the countervailing forces are really limited. Now, that no one likes to see the war in Ukraine, but in the end, it has come out. Right? No one likes to have the war in Taiwan, but there is very limited, in particular in Western countries, limited countervailing forces against such a possible scenario. So that's why the pessimism. Right? But of course, this is only my rather preliminary judgments.
Okay. Anybody else who also wants to answer the question, respond to the question about why some regions are mobilized to act against their own economic interests in the U.S. General discourse of China threat?
I could.
Yeah, Sarah, please.
Well, why do countries act against their own obvious best interests? Sometimes there is a real divide between the economic interests that have developed over a long period of time, business and what is produced, and the area in which many people work, and the political establishment. And certainly in Taiwan, the US has, and in many other countries, made intense political inroads, both through literally thousands of NGOs and NED-funded programs, but also into the actual existing political parties. Certainly with the DPP, the Democratic People's Party, there's a lot of interaction, and it hardly is an independent party. The US influence is so strong, even against the wider interests of Taiwan. Now, also with the KMT, historically, it was the US that provided after their defeat in the Chinese Revolution, who helped the defeated forces find refuge in Taiwan, who literally lifted them to Taiwan, who armed and surrounded the island. That was the US. So there are intense involvement in both political parties. Now, over years, because the KMT's position was always that China is one and that Taiwan is part of China, so they were in a bit of a quandary of how to approach this. Now, there's speakers here who know so much more about Taiwan, so I really won't, I shouldn't go into this too much. But just to say that it's not only, we could look at what's happening in Europe, it's absolutely against the interests of the European Union to break their relations with Russia. And Germany in particular, I mean, they had 10 times the trade with Russia that they had with the US. But once war begins and there's literally thousands of sanctions, the US demanded every country of Europe had to pass their own individual sanctions through their parliaments and legislatively hammer it down. So this is what they want to do in the region. This is what they want to do with Japan, with South Korea, with the Philippines, is force these countries, not only Taiwan, but force each of these countries to end their economic trade relations, imports and exports with China, which now predominate. And who stands to benefit from this? The United States. I mean, it's so obvious that it's hard to dispute it. So we really have to look, there's a term even in law, que bono, who benefits? And certainly in the threats on Taiwan, and we can see with the balloon incident, it doesn't have to be a very big thing. Obviously, every country in the world that has a military establishment also has an intelligence agencies. That's not news. That's no shock to the US. I mean, I fully believe this is a weather balloon blown off course, but the idea that China would have any intelligence apparatus is an attack on the US. Every country does this in self-defense. That's not unusual. But one incident becomes a reason for wild publicity and threats and legislation and so on. So we can see it doesn't take a big incident. Anything can be inflated, just as a balloon can be inflated. A political incident can be inflated to explosive proportions. So I do agree with the speaker that said, in essence, war has already started, but it doesn't mean it will succeed. That's what we should keep in mind. There are real threats being made on China. There is an attempt to use Taiwan, but the US position is deteriorating on every front, and its military is not all powerful. Even Afghanistan, the poorest, least developed country, one of the poorest and least developed in the world, the US did not prevail. So we should we should know. But nevertheless, we need to rally forces. We need to stand up against this war and to raise to others the great, great danger. I'm sorry, my answer was too long. My apology on that.
No, not at all. I think it's a very good question that we all have to think about, why people of different regions can be mobilized to act against their own economic interest. In fact, I think the Chinese government have been hoping that they can persuade American people that to have a good relationship between China and the US is in the interest of American people, and it is in the interest of American society. And let's hope that this discourse can also be played out in a wider social discourse as well. And so
if I may briefly add, I mean, there are two questions here. I'll briefly respond to both of them. Why do countries so often act against their own economic interests? I mean, because of imperialism and frankly, because of the US aggression against its own allies. I mean, the US blew up Germany's Nord Stream pipelines with Russia. We now have report basically proving that from Seymour Hersh, one of the world's most respected investigative journalists. And Germany is one of the US's closest so-called allies. It reminds me of Henry Kissinger's infamous quote that the US has no permanent friends, only interests. And unfortunately, that's why these countries so often act against their own economic interests. In terms of whether or not I truly think there will be war, well, it depends how you define war. If you mean conventional military war between the US and China, unfortunately, I do think it's a very real possibility, but it depends on a few factors. First of all, the economic war has already begun. The information war has been going on for years. The hybrid war has already begun. But I do think that there are a few ways that it could be stopped. I mean, a mass movement, a reinvigoration of the anti-war movement, bigger than it was in the lead up to the Iraq War. I mean, those are all necessary things. These are not inevitable inevitable developments in history that we can never have any influence on. But I think also within the island of Taiwan, there are several developments that could potentially be hurdles for the US war drive. One, the KMT just won the regional elections last year, and there's a new election coming up next year. And it's likely that the KMT will win for leadership of Taiwan. And if they do win, then it seems like they'll probably be less, I mean, I don't want to say necessarily that they would be strong enough to resist the US war drive, but they would be less susceptible to that US pressure than the current leadership. But I also think that if you listen to what a lot of people in Washington are saying and read what they say carefully, and I'm not talking about just politicians, I'm talking about Pentagon leadership, they've made the assessment that if they're going to strike against China, they need to do it in the short term. Now, not everyone in the US political class is completely on board with that. There are divisions within the ruling class as always, but there does seem to be a pretty big consensus that with this proxy war against Russia now, and with China, the temporary Western lead over China technologically with these new sanctions, and with China's move toward de-dollarization, but with China not yet having the new financial infrastructure it needs to be able to be completely independent of the US dollar, it seems that they've made the assessment that if they're going to attack, they need to do it in the short term. And there is a lot of momentum pushing them in that way. So yes, to answer your question, I think that it's very possible that we could see conventional war between the US and China within the next few years.
Okay, thanks, Ben. And we also have a few hands up. So Dennis?
Oh, yes. Hello. Thank you very much for recognizing me. I want to first say that I appreciate very much this presentation. It's been very gratifying and revelatory. I want to say that, you know, my family are Taiwan run. They are Taiwanese. They were people who escaped the the communist victory of the Civil War in 1949. They fled to Taiwan with the rest of the Kuomintang regime. My great uncle was Wei Daoming, one of the last ambassadors to Japan for the Kuomintang government in China. His wife was Zheng Yushu, one of the first female magistrates for the Kuomintang government when they still had control of the mainland government. So I've grown up in this family of super Taiwanese patriots, okay? But I realized even, you know, as I was growing up and developing more of an awareness of the politics that were going on, that it seemed that the villainous position of communist, of mainland China seemed to be a bit exaggerated and couched in hyperbolic rhetoric. So I made it a point myself that I would go to China at some point in my life and see what it was really like, as much as I can, as just being a regular citizen. And so I worked for 2 years teaching at a university in northeastern China in Liaoning province. And during the breaks that I had, which were considerable, considering things like during the Chinese New Year, all students and professors are given 2 months of holiday. So I took this opportunity to travel around China as much as possible and see what, as much as I could, again, from the grassroots level, what the situation in mainland China was like. And I saw that again, yes, a lot of the rhetoric about how much, you know, there's this lack of freedom of expression and repression that goes on there, that a lot of this was unfounded. And I guess, and especially threats made toward Taiwan are very much exaggerated and unfounded. So, and I think a very good example of this is the Vietnam War. How much hyperbole and hysterical rhetoric was created to create this justification for this war in Vietnam, in which tragically 50,000 American lives were lost, young men were lost, including, well, my own best friend fought in it. Luckily, he survived. But the outcome was that the United States lost this war. The communist government took over all of Vietnam, and none of the horrible things that the businessmen in America said would happen to all of Southeast Asia ever transpired. It was a huge, terrible, tragic waste of U.S. resources and especially of U.S. lives, and none of the terrible things that were said to have would transpire as a result of this loss ever occurred. And now we haven't learned our lesson. We're still now applying the same kind of rhetoric and hysterical claims against mainland China now, and its supposed military adventures or threats that is posing to the rest of Asia. So again, I thank very much this panel for presenting this alternative point of view, and how we need to back off from this kind of hyperbole and hysterics against China. So my question is, you know, again, is our transcripts of these presentations available that were made in this panel, and especially I'm very glad to see that all of it has been recorded. This discussion has been recorded, and will that be readily available to the public? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dennis, for sharing your experiences in China and your observations. As to what may whether we're going to be able to make the transcription available to everybody, I have to consult with the IMG people and then let you know. Maybe they can answer that question towards the very end of this panel. Okay, I have Paulina and then Chris, followed by Chris, and then Zhiguang. So the three of you will be lined up to speak, to ask your questions. Chris, please. Oh, sorry, Paulina first.
Hi, thank you very much. So I have a question that is potentially directed towards Ben Norton, but also if anyone else would like to chime in, that would be great. But basically, when we're talking about conventional war, I'm just interested to hear about if there's any kind of prediction about the global ramifications of this in terms of, while we can understand that it would be foremost the US and China, but I wonder how many other actors, not just in the Pacific theater, but in other theaters, do you think would be involved in this conflict? And as we can see with the Ukraine war, there are a lot of actors involved in terms of using this as a proxy. They're not necessarily all on the ground, but I do wonder if there's any risk of there being multiple actors actually on the ground for this type of conflict. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess I'll briefly address that, and then I'm sure other people have insights. Well, I do think that in general, in the past 30 years since the end of the first Cold War, especially if you look at US military writings and the Rand Corporation reports, there has been a move in general toward hybrid war and other forms of warfare. And you know, there's this popular term in Washington, instead of saying economic war, they love to say economic statecraft. It's very common to see, but it's really economic warfare. And if you look at, I don't have the graph right here in front of me, but maybe if I can come back later, I'll show it. But I saw a study recently with the application of unilateral sanctions by the United States from during the first Cold War until today. And it just completely skyrocketed. And especially in the past decade, there's been a significant move toward economic warfare. And ironically, you know, there's been a lot of discussion of how the use of sanctions has backfired and boomerang. There's a new book published by a mainstream scholar last year about that, the boomerang effect of sanctions, and how it did accelerate the drive toward de-dollarization and the creation of new financial alternatives. And ironically, that has set the stage for the possibility of more conventional war, because the US economy is so deeply intertwined, especially with the Chinese economy, but other economies around the world in this era of neoliberal globalization. It's the global economy is still deeply intertwined. But I should point out, I mean, this is a point that I learned from Ha-Joon Chang, so I'm stealing his point, a good development economist. He pointed out that, in fact, when World War I happened, it was when the world was the most globalized. There's this idea that globalization is new, of course, because neoliberals have tried to monopolize the concept of globalization. There's been globalization for thousands of years. The Silk Road was globalization, but we're in a particular paradigm of neoliberal globalization. Ha-Joon Chang points out that it's not even a matter of technology, that in fact, in the lead up to World War I, there was, as a percentage of global GDP, it was a moment of peak global interchange. And that was using, what we would consider very unsophisticated technology, like cables, not even like the use of like non-cable technology for communications. In order to communicate across countries, they still had cable lines, right? So just because an economy is very globalized doesn't mean that there's not the possibility of world war. He points out that, in fact, the moment of more economic sovereignty for countries and less globalization was, in fact, the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the period of decolonization. That was the kind of the moment in which it was a low point of global interchange in terms of global connection of the international economy. So I mean, yeah, obviously the US and the Chinese economies are deeply intertwined, but that didn't prevent World War I either. So I mean, it's very hard to say. And another part of your question about countries that could potentially be involved. I mean, if we look at the response of most of the countries around the world to the proxy war in Ukraine, the vast majority of the world has been either neutral or frankly has sided with Russia. There was an article published in Newsweek by 2 former US diplomats, which is very interesting. They acknowledge that 87% of the global population lives in countries that have been neutral and have refused to impose sanctions on Russia. It might be different with China. So for instance, Europe is much more anti-Russia than it is anti-China. And if there is a war with China, I mean, Europe would be, if there are politicians who are willing to challenge Washington, it might be a region of the world that might be slightly more neutral, whereas maybe India would be more on board with a war against China, whereas India has much better relations with Russia, and India has adamantly refused to get involved and refused in the proxy war in Ukraine and has maintained close trade relations with Russia. Now, obviously, the US has been pressuring Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines to get involved. But again, I mean, the RAND Corporation published a report just over a year ago acknowledging that they were having difficulty getting Japan, South Korea, Australia, Thailand, and the Philippines on board with hosting missile systems. I mentioned there has been a change of government, and especially in Japan now, there's much more of a hardline anti-China government. But even then, I mean, it would be economic suicide for Japan to join in a war with China. So, I mean, it could be, if there is some kind of violent conflict that breaks out, it could be like the proxy war in Ukraine, where the vast majority of the world refuses to get involved and continues trading with China. Ironically, despite the sanctions on Russia, the IMF has said that Russia's economy is expected to slightly grow this year and is expected to grow even more next year, whereas the British economy is going to be shrinking this year, according to IMF measurements. So, you know, Russian trade with Asia has significantly increased. So even if there is a war, there might actually still be an increase in trade. In fact, ironically, Chinese trade with the US has increased in the past few years. So we're in this very strange world where the economy is globalized and wars happen and economic interchange increases. So I don't think that's going to be an obstacle, unfortunately.
Okay, anybody else who wants to respond to the question?
Yeah, hello. In all these accounts, the U.S. and NATO are the unquestioned villains. But I wonder if, in the case of China, is the massive increase in its military surveillance capacities, and it's gaining an economic foothold in every continent. Are these worrisome signs of an incipient imperialist type aggression that we should be concerned about?
Okay, Bob, I think you jumped the queue. The next in line for asking question. Fine, you asked your question. I'm going to also just to bring Chris. Chris, you can turn on your mic to ask your question.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. I did, and thank you to all the speakers. At the same time that the U.S. is conducting military exercises directed at China and Nevada with Australia, the United Kingdom, and the U.S. The vice chairman of the KMT is visiting the PRC, and my question is, with the electoral victory, as talked about, of the KMT in the 2022 local elections, and with possible victory of the KMT in the 2024 presidential elections, a party that is anti-independence. Has this moved up the U.S. war schedule to 2023 and 24? Is it actually increased the pace of the war drive? Thank you very much.
Okay, so we got two questions on the table. See who would like to address these questions. Zhengbang, would you like to address this question?
For prediction for the local election in 2024, right? Not so sure, because from my own personal perspective, I don't think there's a huge difference between DPP and the KMT. So there's definitely a difference that, you know, KMT always pretend itself is more like pro-China, but essentially they are, you know, kind of pro-US, you know, kind of the political party. So I don't think there's the KMT's win or lose in 2024 will really change the gray, you know, kind of the direction that's between the US and the China, the heightened the intention. But it might slow the pace a little bit, just like, you know, some people mentioned in the chat box. Right now, the KMT just sent a very high level, the vice president to Beijing, right? And that's a, you know, kind of interview of the with the Wang Huning, the political bureau from the, you know, the number 4 people that's in the political bureau. So it shows, you know, the kind of the agreement that, you know, we all agree that, you know, there should be like a reunion or unification of China. But I am not so sure that whether this will be the, you know, the highest principle that the KMT will really hold in the local election, because that's a, you know, in this kind of the style of the democratic election, especially in Taiwan, that we all know that there are so many uncertainties that will took place. So especially in the past 20 years, right, that we see that, you know, in 2000, there's, you know, kind of in the last night, there is a kind of the event crisis. You know, the candidate was shot. That's by a kind of the gun. So it totally changed how the election was, you know, the proceed. So I will see that I don't really, you know, kind of know that whether this will answer your question. But my point is that the KMT or the DPP won't really change, whether will really change the, you know, the situation. That's my kind of the brief answer.
Okay, I think, Bob, the question you raised, of course, is very important, but I think IMG has already organized panel discussions on the very topic that you have just now raised question about. So I would encourage you to look it up in the IMG website for for discussions. So what I have on the list next is Zhiguang, and then we have Sarah and Radhika. Zhiguang, it's your turn. Well, since I do know Zhiguang, so I'm going to give him a brief introduction. So Zhiguang is a professor in international politics at the Fudan University. And he has recently published a book called A New World, Afro-Asian Solidarity and the PRC's Imagination of Global Order. So that's just come out 2022 in Chinese. Okay, Zhiguang, it's your turn.
Oh, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak in the discussion, and thank you very much for the wonderful panels you put together. I want to echo some of the panelists and respond to some of the questions, predominantly with regarding the questions, two correlated questions. One is there going to be a war, a hot war, inevitable hot war between China and the US? And second is the previous question from, I believe, from Bob, and many other discussants, many other participants in the chat box, is China going to be an imperialist power? Well, to me, I think one thing, as a political historian, I think it is very important to sort of refer back to our historical experience of global war. So far, in our human history, war on a global scale happened only since the mid to late 19th century, with one of the first widely reported wars, Boer War, in 1899, and then following by 2 world wars. Throughout the history, during this period, there has been dominating voices in the European countries saying that China, we have to prevent China from rising. China is going to be a threat to the entire world. China, the yellow pearl, is with its rising of economic and political power, will definitely change our way of life. This the world has never been, or European countries have never been strangers to this kind of a scaremongering of the imminent rising of a powerful nation that is not white. Interestingly, historically proven that none of the world wars have been waged in Asia. All the world wars started in Europe. And all the world wars, interestingly, have been waged by imperialist power that are or were running on some form of parliamentary democracy. And China doesn't fit either of the profile. China is not a capitalist country, and China has not had the experience. Sorry, my cat is quite curious about the choice. China has historically never been interested in the issue of war. Of course, we don't have a crystal ball to predict the future, but one thing that we could definitely see into is a recent event, which is China's response to Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. Many of the hot-headed individuals in China and across the world were, before Nancy's visit, they were thinking about how China is going to react. Many people predict that China is going to fly an aircraft and intercept Nancy Pelosi's mid-air. But all these predictions failed. Instead, after Nancy Pelosi left to Taiwan, China started a military exercise that is not necessarily in line with the military exercises that we're familiar with, such as the Russia did during the Second World War. Instead, China shoot a couple of missiles. The positions of those missiles are quite intriguing. It's encirclement of Taiwan. Seven out of the 8 landing spots of the missiles were on the were between mainland China and the Taiwan on the Strait of Taiwan, but one of them was landing between Taiwan and Japan. This is a clear sign not of aggression but encirclement. The ideal of an encirclement, I think it is very important to understand the Chinese mentality. We always want to sort of use the quite European-centric view to understand the imminent coming of a global war. We sort of predict the playbook by following the historical experiences wrote by the past European global wars. But it's not necessarily the case. To China, it is important to emphasize that a speech that Deng Xiaoping made in the UN in 1974. In this speech, in this UN speech, Deng Xiaoping said a very intriguing things about hegemony. Sort of the widely received interpretation of his presence in the UN was like the returning of China to the global stage of a so-called major power, going to join the competition with other major powers. But the actual content of this speech receives very little political attention. The attention towards major powers, in fact, entails a significant but largely unnoticeable flaw in our worldview. This flaw not only jeopardizes our ability to understand the complexity of our reality, but also hinders our capability to imagine an alternative future for a better world order. To Dong, he basically says that imperialism entails its own antithesis. China will not be a hegemonic power. It's because by becoming a hegemonic power, China will fail. China will induce its own decline. I mean, similar notions has been mentioned by Mao in his 1972 the 1972 Sino-US communique. The quote was used by Professor Low in his presentation to say that states want independence, nations want liberation, and people want revolution. It's largely unnoticed when scholars are analyzing the normalization of the Sino-US relations in 1972. Not many people notice this very intriguing, not entirely legal sentence, but quite rather romantic and provocative sentence in this in this document, situating as the preface of the legal document and the foundation of the normalization of China and US relations. It basically argues that China does not seek to be another hegemon, does not want to be the counterpart of the US across the Pacific Ocean. However, if the US cannot behave like a hegemon either, because subjecting to hegemonic-centric worldview means the destroyer of itself, which goes back to goes forward to the 1972 Stone's famous speech in the UN that hegemonic imperialism entails its own antithesis. So I guess, well, I mean, the whole reaction towards that those two questions of me boiled down to the bare minimum is that, first of all, I think we need to revisit our playbook, our toolkit to understand and understand the current situation and predict the future. It's not necessarily inevitable that a war will happen during the circumstance of true power confrontation. It's not necessarily that a rising country is inevitably seeking for domination. Maybe, according to the Chinese experience with sort of a larger third world experience of modernization and development, the purpose of national rejuvenation is the purpose of the liberation of the weak and the oppressed. It actually forms a much bigger and transcendent story, constitutes of the majority of the world's country. It's the majority of the world's nation. It's the story of solidarity and the unification, a story of equality and prosperity for all. And this story hasn't finished yet. And the biggest enemy on our road, on our way to pursue such a goal, is interventionism in any forms. Well, and that's my response to the two questions.
Okay, thank you, Zhi Guang. Then we have Sarah. That's your turn.
Thank you, and it's great to be following the last speaker because we do need to see this in global terms. The interests of the whole world at this point are really against a tiny, tiny class of capitalists who are not even a fraction of 1% of global population, but are brutally deciding the world in their interests. Poverty is greater than at any time in human history. It can easily be solved, as China has shown. We can look at the problems being created and know that there's one force that stands absolutely against resolving any problem. And that is this tiny class rooted most strongly in the US, but not only, not only, and they operate with others who want to continue their rule, their ownership, their decision-making ability versus the people of the world, really the working class of the world. I think we have to understand the basic thing that's going on. Now, the US does want war with China for a reason. They want to break the relations that China has developed and that are developing among a whole number of countries, economic trade that benefits millions and millions of people and is not controlled by the US. So what is the first thing they want to do with a war? It will immediately, of course, impact the people of Africa, of people throughout Asia, of people in Latin America, because the US role is to attempt to break that trade, whether it's with the BRICS countries or Brazil or to India, to the countries of Africa. So that's what they want to break. They want something that will absolutely preoccupy China, make all those trade arrangements and the Belt and Road, how do they shut it down? There are major cities throughout Europe who are involved and have signed agreements with the Belt and Road to redo ports and railroads. US wants to break that. So I think that we have to look at the intention of why does the US want war? What do they hope the war will do? And also what's actually not likely to happen? Because I think as a war, if a war does break out, if there is an incident, and it's easy to create an incident, whether it's a balloon or a plane going down or anything where immediately, as we saw from the Nord Stream, blowing up a pipeline, US has lots of ways to create an incident and then use it as a hysteria. And they've done that so often, anthrax vials and weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Later, it's blown apart, but it launches a war. But we really can see with the present war in Ukraine that it's not likely to go the US way. 2/3 of the countries of the world have not signed on to the sanctions presently. That's an incredible fact. So will they sign on if the US tries to threaten with massive sanctions China? I don't think so. It goes against the interests of almost every country. So we have a big confrontation ahead of us. Will it succeed? I truly don't believe so. I did want to answer one other thing about world wars and what is a world war and what we call world war, because sometimes it's a very Eurocentric term. If it takes place and brings great ruin in Europe, that's a world war. But what wasn't it a global war? The absolute looting of China, of India, of Indonesia to Vietnam, to Africa, to the Middle East, the colonial wars of plunder by the imperialists of that time. That was a global world war. And it went on, it was ruthless and millions died. So whether this is World War III or a continuing war of capitalists trying to continue their domination and people of the world trying to live in solidarity, in exchange, in development, and find ways of solving the huge global problems, world problems that are facing us with climate change, with solving problems of hunger. These are the problems we should be solving, and we have the ability to solve. That's what's forgotten. In earlier times in history, there was not that ability. There is now, and we got to look to the countries most likely to deal with these problems. And I know because of the strength of U.S. propaganda. Very, very important. I thought the speaker who raised the empire of the mind. We're up against a lot, but people of the world are a dominant force, and U.S. is in decline. So let's really hold on to that and let that set as our kind of our anchor.
Thank you, Sarah. And I'm going to give the floor to Radhika for closing this panel. And also, Radhika, perhaps you can also address the question of whether we can have transcript of the entire panel or not. Is that possible?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Hairong. And so first of all, so I wanted to say a couple of things on in response to some of the discussion, and then I will close the panel. But just the practicalities, yes, well, we are going to request all the speakers, if possible, to send us their transcripts or their speeches, and we will put them up on the International Manifesto Group website, if that's possible. Certainly, this has been recorded, and it will be placed on YouTube at the International Manifesto Group YouTube channel. So if you want to listen to any of them again, I certainly want to listen to parts of it again, because it was such a good panel. And I just wanted to add one important point, which I feel many people sort of came close to, but didn't really mention. You know, when we are trying to assess the possibility of war, and when we look at the history of war, and, you know, I think Ben mentioned, you know, this whole idea that somehow if you have globalization, you won't have war. In general, it has been an ideology of the capitalist and imperialist world to talk as though increasing essentially globalization, free markets, free trade, etc., reduce the possibility of war. But if you but if you look at it, if you call things what they really are, then what we are looking at in terms of the international relations is not some kind of international system, but essentially an imperialist system. So the world wars were caused by imperialism. The reason why the world was so allegedly globalized, so economically interdependent, was not because of free trade. It was because of imperialism. It was imperialism that made economic relations between far-flung places so that a small part of the world would benefit from it. And the wars were the direct result. The world wars were the direct result of inter-imperialist competition. And as Sarah has reminded us, the fact of the matter is that there were wars, there have been wars all along. There have been wars of imperial subjugation. Now, what does this mean for today? What does it mean for the prospect of war today? Well, if you think about the fact that the power of imperialism has actually been declining since about 1914, since about the outbreak of the first inter-imperialist war, and not declining fast enough for the good of anyone, but it has been declining. The result of that has been that the United States cannot, in fact, easily go to war, even with Iran, say, which it would have loved to. If it felt that it could actually subjugate Iran, it would have done that. But it can't. It has to think twice. After Vietnam, the United States doesn't even have a draft. Who is going to fight all these wars? That is why the wars are taking the course that they're taking, as we see now, in the form of imperial, proxy wars and so on. And that's why the United States is going to try and make Taiwan into a proxy. The question is whether it will agree. And the other important thing is that another part of the decline of imperialism is simply the development of the rest of the world, particularly China. And this development also means that it is very unlikely that the West will remain united on this. I really doubt that the Europeans, who have been reluctantly at least going along with the conflict over Ukraine, will go along with the United States over that. And perhaps I'm sounding too optimistic, but these are considerations that we must factor into our thinking about the possibility of war. Now, Hairong, okay, you asked me to close, and I see there are two further hands. So I'm going to ask each of these two people to make very brief interventions, and then I will bring the meeting to a close. So Chan-Chi Kun and then Alan.
Yes, I actually I actually posted a question in the chat box, so maybe I'll read it out. Okay, and this is actually a spillover question from a previous IMG webinar. Okay, also on Taiwan, okay, Taiwan Strait, where I had a brief exchange with Chen Meixia regarding desinization. Okay, so the question is, does Beijing feel some degree of urgency in reuniting with Taiwan, insofar as DPP's desinization initiatives in education, cultural identity, etc., maybe even extending to use of dialects versus national language? Okay, whether these DPP initiatives may engender the kinds of identity problems, we called it that Beijing faced with youthful generations of Hong Kongers. That's the question.
Okay, and Alan, would you like to make your intervention, and then I will go to the panelists if they wish to respond to the question.
It's very simple. What can we do to reduce the risk and cost of war? And the answer is, we can become active. We don't just have to listen. And so these seminars and the IMG were set up because the vital function is necessary, which is an answer to the question why the anti-war movement is weak. I think it's weak because in the West, at any rate, it was not anti-imperialist, it was a peace movement. That played a very important role at the time, but faced with the direct conflict between imperialism and those it wishes to send back to the colonial status they once occupied, the anti-war movement is paralyzed because it doesn't understand the causes. So what are we doing? We're helping people to understand the causes. So I think that what I want to say is you can help. You can make a difference by supporting what we do. So Radhika mentioned that, you know, we're going to try and get a transcript. Well, we're a volunteer organization. You can help. It's a very simple thing. Fill out the volunteer form on the IMG website and say, I can put in an hour or 2 hours and help you produce a transcript. Several people have done that already, and it's why we've already been able to do transcripts. Share what we do, like what we do. The channel, in the chat, you'll see links to our YouTube channel, which is where this video will soon be posted. And like it. It's very important. Like changes the algorithm that YouTube uses, and it means it comes to other people's attention. It's a very small thing, just like and share. And there's a slightly larger thing you can do, which is underneath the videos. You'll see a place where you can pay money. We are a volunteer organization, but there's certain minimal technical requirements for administration. And we very much hope that you'll be able to assist us, especially with even small but regular donations, which will put us on a sound footing and mean that instead of running around trying to raise money, we can actually get on with helping people like Hairong and Jiguang and their friends for this marvelous seminar, for which we are truly grateful.
Okay, thanks. Do any panelists want to respond to anything that was just said? I don't see any hands, so I think I would bring this session to this magnificent seminar to a close by thanking the organizers, Hairong in particular, for organizing it, thanking all the speakers who have been really very good as well. And really sort of gave us lots to think about. All the people who attended and have stayed throughout this very long seminar. So thank you all very much. And please watch out for the next International Manifesto Group webinar, which is going to be on the 175th anniversary of the Communist Manifesto. As Mao said, the people want revolution. And so all of those people who want revolution will, I hope, attend. We will be sending out the notice for that very soon. So once again, thank you very much. And as Alan said, please think of supporting us in whatever way you can, even if it's just by liking and sharing. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Radhika, before we really close, just one more word.
Yes.
For people who are interested, we actually organized a previous panel, which is on understanding the Taiwan question and cross-strait relations. So for information about that panel, it's already on the IMG website, so people can check it out. And also, this topic we discussed today is extremely important for both regional and global futures. So we're going to continue our discussion, bring the discussion forward to the present and the future, as well as historically going back. And this is a question about how people's subjectivity has been historically constructed. So how to understand that process of construction? What have been the suppressed history, which we have yet to discover? So these are the important questions as well. And I think we're going to have one more, we're going to have a next discussion as well. Maybe in 1 month or 2 months, then we're going to have a panel on this very topic. So people can also look forward to that.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.